My dad made me work in his business for free. Now he's shocked. I started my own. I can still remember the first time my father told me I should be grateful. I was 16, standing behind the counter of his business. A small yet well-known company that had been in our family for generations. The air smelled of sweat and old paperwork, the ringing of the phone never ceasing, the customers always coming, always demanding. I had just finished a shift that ran well past the time I was supposed to be home, exhausted and aching, when I finally asked the question I had been too scared to voice before. Do I at least get something for this? The way he looked at me still burns in my memory. Disappointment, disapproval, as if I had just spat on everything he had ever given me. He shook his head, let out a sharp exhale, and with a voice that carried the weight of expectation and authority, he said, "You should be grateful for the experience. Other kids don't get this kind of opportunity." And just like that, I was trapped. For years, I was a shadow in my father's business, working long hours, never on the payroll, always being told that my reward would come later. When you're older, you'll understand. One day, this will all be yours. You're learning things no one else your age knows. And so, I stayed. I stayed because I was convinced that if I worked hard enough, if I proved my dedication, if I kept my head down and did everything he asked, he would finally see me as more than free labor. But that day never came. Instead, I watched as other employees, people who had walked in with no history, no connection, no blood ties, were given actual positions, salaries, benefits. I saw them climb the ladder, take on new responsibilities, gain my father's approval in ways I never did. I was expected to do the work, but never to expect anything in return. And when I finally realized that, when the weight of all those years of unpaid, unacknowledged sacrifice settled into my bones, I walked away. Starting my own business wasn't a carefully planned decision. It was an act of survival. At first, I didn't even know what I wanted to build. I only knew that I couldn't keep being a servant in a place where I should have been an equal. So I took what I had learned, the skills, the experience, the work ethic that he had drilled into me without ever compensating me for it, and I built something of my own. It started small. A few clients, a makeshift office, late nights filled with anxiety and doubt. But the difference was, every effort I put in belonged to me. Every deal, every connection, every win. It wasn't for someone else's legacy. It was for mine. And then suddenly, the business was growing. More than I expected. More than I could have imagined. I wasn't just getting by, I was thriving. And that's when my father found out. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. I had just landed a major contract, one that put my name in the same conversations as his, when my phone rang. My father's number. I stared at the screen for a long moment, debating whether or not to answer. But I knew him. If I ignored him, he'd just show up. So, I answered. His voice was clipped, sharp. "We need to talk. Now." I didn't ask why. I already knew. When I arrived at his office, the same office I had spent years working in, the same place where I had been nothing more than an unpaid extension of his will, I felt something strange settle inside me. I wasn't scared anymore. I wasn't intimidated. I wasn't the kid standing behind the counter, waiting for validation. I was his competition. The moment I stepped inside, he was already pacing. His face was tight, his movements stiff, the kind of barely contained rage that came from losing control of something he thought he owned. I shut the door behind me, slowly, deliberately. "You wanted to talk?" He turned, eyes narrowing. "When were you going to tell me?" I blinked, feigning innocence. "Tell you what?" "Don't play games with me." His voice was like steel, sharp and heavy. "Your business, your so-called company. When were you planning to tell me you were trying to compete with me?" A slow smile curled at the edges of my lips. "Compete with you?" I let the words hang in the air, savoring them. "I thought you'd be proud of me." His hands clenched into fists. "Proud? You took everything I taught you and... what? Stabbed me in the back?" I let out a small laugh, shaking my head. "Stabbed you in the back? Dad, you never even let me in the room. I spent years working hard for nothing, so I did what you always told me to do. I figured it out on my own." His jaw tightened. You didn't build that on your own. Everything you know, you learned from me. And everything you know, you learned from someone else, I countered, my voice steady. That's how business works. But the difference between us, I earned what I have. You just expected me to hand over my life for free. The silence between us was suffocating. And then, he laughed. A short, bitter sound. You don't know what you've done, he muttered, shaking his head. I raised an eyebrow. Oh? Enlighten me. His expression darkened. You think you're free from me? You think you can just walk away? I built this business from the ground up. Do you have any idea how many people owe me favors? How many doors I can close for you? Ah. There it was. The real reason he was angry. Not because I had left. Not because I had succeeded. But because he couldn't control me anymore. I met his gaze unflinching. Try. His lips parted slightly as if he hadn't expected me to call his bluff. I took a slow step forward, lowering my voice just enough to let him feel the weight of every word. You taught me how to work hard, how to be ruthless, how to navigate an industry where only the strongest survive. I tilted my head slightly. So, go ahead, Dad. Do your worst. He stared at me, his face unreadable, and I saw it, uncertainty, because deep down he knew. I wasn't a kid anymore. I wasn't his free labor. I was his rival, and I wasn't afraid of him. Walking out of my father's office should have felt like a victory, and in some ways it was. I had finally faced him, not as an obedient worker, not as the child desperate for his approval, but as an equal, as someone who had built something of their own without his permission, without his support, without a single dollar of his money. But I knew my father too well to believe that this was over. If there was one thing he couldn't stand, it was losing control. And right now, that was exactly what was happening. It didn't take long for the retaliation to begin. The first hit came subtly, too subtly for someone who didn't know him. A client I had been in final negotiations with suddenly pulled out. No warning, no explanation, just a polite, impersonal email apologizing for the change in direction. At first I thought it was just bad luck, until it happened again, and again. 3 potential deals, gone in less than a week. I wasn't stupid. I knew what this was. My father was making calls. The thing about power, it's never just about what you own. It's about who owes you. And my father had spent decades making sure people owed him. When I worked for him, I saw it firsthand. He had built his reputation on more than just good business sense. He had built it on favors, connections, quiet little arrangements where people didn't even realize they had become indebted to him until it was too late. And now, he was calling in those debts, not to destroy me outright. No, that would be too obvious. He was blocking my path, shutting doors before I could even reach them, making sure I understood that no matter how far I thought I had come, I was still in his shadow. I sat in my office, not his, and stared at my laptop screen, my jaw tight as another email loaded. Dear protagonist, after careful reconsideration, we've decided to move forward with another vendor at this time. We appreciate your interest and wish you the best in your future endeavors. I exhaled slowly, tapping my fingers against the desk. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the message. My father didn't need to say it out loud. I see you, I know what you're doing, and I will crush you before you become a threat. I clenched my jaw. He thinks I'll back down. That's the mistake he always made, assuming I was weak, assuming I would fold under pressure, assuming that, because I had spent years following his rules, I didn't know how to break them. But he had underestimated me before, and he was about to do it again. I made my own calls, not to the clients I had lost. No, they were too deep in his pocket. I went lower, to the vendors, the suppliers, the people who made the whole system work, but never got the recognition for it. The ones my father had spent years squeezing for profit, treating them as disposable while they kept his business afloat. And it turned out, they didn't owe him as much as he thought. 2 weeks later, I walked into one of my father's supplier meetings, not as his employee, not as his backup, as his competition. He wasn't expecting me. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened when I stepped inside, the flicker of something behind his carefully composed mask, annoyance, disbelief, maybe even a sliver of fear. Good. I took my seat at the long conference table across from him, my posture relaxed. He sat at the head, as always, the king of his domain. surrounded by familiar faces. Some of the suppliers looked at me with curiosity, others with mild surprise. But I wasn't here to impress them. I was here to take them. The negotiations started as they always did, smooth, polite, my father commanding the room with the effortless authority he had spent years perfecting. But then I spoke, and I made them an offer, a better one. Because I had learned from him, I knew exactly how he did business, where he cut costs, where he overcharged, where he made just enough effort to keep people loyal without ever making them feel like they had options. And I had given them an option. The silence in the room stretched after I finished, the weight of my words settling in. I could feel my father's gaze burning into me. But I didn't look at him. I looked at the people who mattered, and one by one, I saw the shift. Not all of them. Not yet. But enough. Enough to know that the foundation my father had built wasn't as unshakable as he thought. Enough to know that he had never expected me to fight back like this. The meeting ended, the suppliers murmuring as they left, some already exchanging glances considering my proposal. I stood, adjusting my suit jacket, taking my time. I could feel my father watching me, his body still, his expression unreadable. I waited until we were alone before turning to face him. He exhaled slowly, standing, his movements controlled. That was cute. I smirked. I thought so. He stepped closer, his eyes sharp. You think you can come into my world and steal from me? I tilted my head. Steal? Funny, that's exactly how I felt after working for you for free all those years. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. You don't know what you're doing. I held his gaze. You keep telling yourself that. There was no disappointment in his expression, no condescension, no subtle reminder that I was nothing without him. There was anger, real, unfiltered anger, because he knew. He wasn't just losing control of me. He was losing. I walked out of that meeting knowing one thing for certain. This wasn't just about proving myself anymore. It wasn't about making him see my worth. It was about taking back everything he had stolen from me, every unpaid hour, every broken promise, every moment he made me feel like I was less than what I was. He thought he could stop me. He thought he could shut me down before I even got started. But I was just getting started. This was only the beginning. I left that meeting knowing one thing for certain. This wasn't a fight my father had ever planned for. For years, he had shaped me into something useful, something loyal, something that worked for his benefit without question or hesitation. He had built me up as an extension of himself, not a competitor, not a threat. And that was his greatest mistake. He had spent so much time making sure I knew my place that he never imagined I'd walk away from it. But I had. And now, he had to watch as I built something stronger than he ever could. The fallout came quickly. By the end of the week, whispers were turning into real consequences. Some of his suppliers had already agreed to work with me, quietly, carefully, testing the waters before making any drastic moves. But I knew business. I knew that once one domino fell, the rest would follow. I didn't need to steal his empire. I just needed to make it unstable enough that people started looking for a way out. And that was exactly what was happening. My father's first response was denial. He thought I was bluffing, that I had made a few desperate moves, that my little company was nothing more than a passing phase. His second response was anger. The calls started coming in. Not to me, of course. He wouldn't give me that satisfaction. But I heard from mutual connections, former employees, people who owed neither of us their loyalty. He was furious. At the suppliers for considering my offers, at the clients for even entertaining the idea of working with me, at himself for not seeing this coming. But mostly, he was furious at me, because in his mind, this wasn't just business. It was betrayal. I wasn't just someone trying to carve out a space in the market. I was the son who turned against him. And that was something he wouldn't forgive. The call finally came 2 weeks later. I was in my office, not his, going over the latest numbers when my phone buzzed. My father's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Silence at first. Then, his voice. Steady. Low. Controlled. But just barely. We need to talk. I leaned back in my chair, tapping my fingers against the desk. I thought we already did. His exhale was sharp, slow, measured. Not like this. I considered telling him no, letting him stew in the mess he had created. But a part of me, the part that wanted to look him in the eye and see just how much this had shaken him, knew I had to go. "Fine," I said. "Your office?" A pause. "No, yours." When he arrived, he looked out of place. This wasn't his domain. This wasn't a space where he held the power. He had spent years towering over me, demanding respect, expecting obedience. But here, I was the one behind the desk, and I could see it in his face, the realization of what that meant. He didn't sit, neither did I. "You've made a mess of things," he said, crossing his arms. I tilted my head. "Have I?" His jaw tightened. "You don't understand what you've done." "I understand perfectly." I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm. "I built something for myself, without you, and now you don't know how to handle it." He let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. This was never how it was supposed to be. I laughed. "Oh, I know. I was supposed to stay under your control forever, working for free, doing whatever you told me to, waiting for a reward that was never coming." He didn't deny it. He didn't even try. Instead, he watched me carefully, his gaze heavy with something almost unreadable. Frustration, maybe, or regret. Then finally he said it. "Come back." The words hit me like a punch to the chest, not because I wanted to, but because I had never expected him to ask. I studied him, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of manipulation, some kind of last-ditch effort to regain control. But he actually looked tired, like he knew he was losing, and he hated it. I let the silence stretch between us before finally speaking. "Why would I do that?" His lips pressed together. "Because you belong here." I raised an eyebrow. "I belong where I'm valued, where I'm respected, where I'm actually paid for my work." "You'd be paid," he said quickly. "A real salary, a real position, not like before." I almost laughed. Almost. But I could see the desperation in his offer. Because he wasn't offering this out of kindness. He was offering it because he needed me, because he could feel the cracks forming in his empire, and he knew that without me, those cracks would only get bigger. I took a slow breath. "I have my own business now." He nodded. "Then let's combine them." I stiffened. "You want a partnership?" He didn't answer right away. And that was answer enough. He didn't want a partner. He wanted to swallow my success before it could grow any bigger. I shook my head, exhaling slowly. "No." His expression darkened. "You're making a mistake." I met his gaze, steady, unwavering. "No," I said softly. "The mistake was thinking I ever needed you." His jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists, but he didn't argue, because he knew. He knew. And that was the final victory. The next morning, I got an email from one of his former suppliers. They were switching to my company. A week later, it happened again, and again. And then, one of his oldest clients, one of the big ones, the ones that had been with him for years, signed with me instead. His empire wasn't falling. Not yet. But it was cracking. And I wasn't done. Months passed. And then, one day, I got another call. Not from him. From someone else. A buyer. They were looking to acquire a company in my industry. They had been watching both mine and my father's. But they weren't interested in his. They were interested in mine. The offer was life-changing. I could have said no. I could have kept building, expanding, turning my company into something even bigger. But there was a different kind of victory in taking the deal. Because while I was moving forward, my father was still fighting to hold on to what he had left. I took the deal, and when the papers were signed, I sent him one last email. I won. No explanation, no gloating, just 2 words. 2 words that said everything, 2 words that made it clear I had never needed him, and now he would never recover from losing me. My dad disappeared for 15 years. Now he wants to walk me down the aisle like nothing happened. I had long since stopped wondering what my father would say if he ever saw me again. I used to imagine it when I was younger, spinning intricate scenarios in my head where he'd come back, maybe kneel before me with tears in his eyes, confessing that he had made a terrible mistake. Or maybe he'd have some grand excuse, something so unbelievable yet real enough that I'd be forced to forgive him. Then I grew up, and I realized something painful in its simplicity. He had left, and he had stayed gone. 15 years. He had missed my birthdays, my graduations, my heartbreaks, my triumphs. He had been nothing more than a shadow in the corner of old photographs, a name spoken in hushed tones that my mother tried to erase from our lives like a stain she couldn't quite scrub out. And then, just like that, he was here, standing in front of me, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, his hair grayer than I remembered, his face lined with years I hadn't been there to witness. "You look just like your mother," he said, a quiet, careful reverence in his voice. I didn't speak. I just stared, every fiber of my being screaming at me to process the sheer audacity of it all. He cleared his throat, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know this is unexpected." Unexpected? My voice came out as a whisper, as if the air had been punched from my lungs. I let the word sit there between us, let him hear the weight of it. 15 years? And you think this is just unexpected? He swallowed. "I know I have a lot to explain." "You think?" A flicker of something, shame, maybe, crossed his face. He exhaled sharply, glancing down at the ground like a child caught sneaking in past curfew. I heard about your wedding, and I thought maybe—" I let out a breathless laugh. It wasn't amusement. It was disbelief. Something jagged and bitter lodged in my throat. "You thought maybe what? That you could just show up, slip into a tux, walk me down the aisle like you didn't vanish from my life?" He flinched. "Good. I'm still your father," he murmured, like the words alone meant something. I felt something in me crack. "No, you were my father. Once, a long time ago. But fathers don't just disappear without a word and come back when it's convenient for them." Silence. For a moment, he just stood there, watching me with eyes that looked too much like my own. Then he took a step forward. "Please, just let me explain." "Explain?" I hissed, stepping back before he could get too close. "You don't get to explain 15 years of silence in one conversation." His lips pressed into a thin line, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "I had my reasons." "Then you should have told me back then. You should have called. Written. Anything. But you didn't. And now you think you can just walk back into my life like it's a freaking movie?" His shoulders sagged slightly, his eyes flickering with something I didn't care to name. "I didn't know how to come back. You didn't even try." I wanted to scream, wanted to let out every ounce of fury that had been simmering beneath my skin for years. But the words caught in my throat, thick and heavy with something dangerously close to grief. He was here. After all this time, after all the years I had spent trying to kill the part of me that had once waited for him. He was here. But it didn't mean anything. Not anymore. And yet some sick, desperate part of me still wanted to know. "Why now?" I asked finally, voice quieter this time. "Why come back now after all this time?" He hesitated. And in that hesitation, I saw it. There was something he wasn't telling me. Something more than just regret. Something heavier lurking beneath the surface. But before I could push him further, the church doors swung open, and my mother's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "What the hell is he doing here?" The sound of my mother's voice cracked through the air like thunder, shattering the fragile moment between me and the man who had once called himself my father. I turned my head just in time to see her storming toward us, her expression twisted in fury. Her hands clenched at her sides, the same way they always had when she was barely holding herself together. It was the look I had seen too many times before, one that usually came before an explosion. "What the hell is he doing here?" she demanded again, her voice sharp, brittle. My father straightened, his face unreadable, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He hadn't expected her to show up so soon. Maybe he thought he'd have more time to ease his way in, to win me over before she could interfere. But if that was his plan, it was already falling apart. "I came to see my child," he said evenly, but the words tasted sour the moment they left his mouth. Mother let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, now she's your child? Now that she's getting married, suddenly you care?" I could feel the heat rising in my chest, my heart pounding as I watched them glare at each other like two adversaries preparing for war. "Mom," I started, but she cut me off. "No," she snapped, her eyes never leaving him. "He doesn't get to do this. He doesn't get to waltz in here after 15 years and act like he belongs." "I'm not here to fight," my father said, though his tone was anything but peaceful. "I just wanted to see her, to talk." "To talk?" my mother scoffed. "Where was all this need to talk when she was growing up without you? When she was crying herself to sleep, wondering why her father didn't love her enough to stay?" I flinched, because the words hit harder than I expected them to. It had been years since I let myself think about those nights. The nights when I had stared at the ceiling, trying to piece together why I wasn't enough for him to stay. The nights when I had convinced myself he must be dead because the alternative, that he was alive and had simply chosen not to be here, was too painful to accept. But he was alive. He had been out there somewhere, living his life, while I had been here, learning how to live without him. "I made mistakes," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "But I came back. Doesn't that count for something?" I let out a shaky breath. "You don't get to decide when you're a father," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't just get to show up when it's convenient for you and expect everything to be fine." His face twisted, like he wanted to argue but knew he had no defense. I wanted to be there for you," he tried again, as if that would change anything. "You wanted to be here for me, or you wanted to be seen?" Silence. Because we both knew the answer. This wasn't about me. It was about him. About whatever guilt had finally caught up with him after all these years. Maybe he thought showing up now, making some grand gesture, would be enough to wash away the past. That if he stood beside me in front of all those wedding guests smiling for the cameras, it would be proof that he had never really abandoned me. But the truth was, he had, and no amount of pretending could change that. "You need to leave," my mother said, her voice steady now, controlled. "She doesn't need this today. Not on her wedding day." My father's gaze flickered between us, searching for something. Maybe permission, maybe hope. But I gave him nothing. I just turned away. "Please," he said, his voice almost desperate now. "Just let me stay. Let me be part of this, just for today." I closed my eyes, inhaled sharply, and when I finally looked at him again, I knew. "You don't belong here." The words landed between us like a final nail in the coffin. My father stared at me for a long moment, something breaking in his expression. But he didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just nodded once, his shoulders slumping ever so slightly, and then, without another word. My father walked away, just like he always had, and yet, as I watched him disappear through the heavy church doors, I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt tired, like the weight of 15 years had finally settled on my shoulders all at once. I stood there in silence, my mother still beside me, her breathing heavy, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the doors, at the place where he had been just moments ago, as if she wasn't convinced he was truly gone. "Are you okay?" she asked finally, her voice softer than I expected. I opened my mouth to say yes, to brush it off like I always did, but the words got stuck in my throat. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure. Was I okay? I had spent years preparing for this moment, imagining what I would say, how I would react if my father ever tried to reappear in my life. But now that it had actually happened, it didn't feel like the victory I had once dreamed of. I wasn't the little girl crying herself to sleep anymore. I wasn't the teenager desperately searching for answers that would never come. I was a woman standing at the edge of her future, and I had to make a choice that wasn't dictated by my past. I had to decide what I wanted. "Do you think he'll come back?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. My mother let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "I don't know. But even if he does, that doesn't mean you have to let him in." I nodded, my chest tightening. She was right. For years I had told myself that if he ever came back, I would demand answers, that I wouldn't let him walk away again without an explanation. But the truth was, I had already gotten my answer. He had left because he chose to. And nothing he said now, no excuse, no apology, could ever change that. I turned to my mother, really looking at her this time. She had always been my constant, the one who had stayed, who had done everything in her power to make sure I never felt alone, even when she was barely holding herself together. And yet, I had spent so many years resenting her too, resenting the way she had never talked about him, never given me the closure I had begged for. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked suddenly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "Why didn't you ever tell me why he left?" She swallowed, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. "Because I knew it wouldn't change anything." I furrowed my brow. "What do you mean?" She sighed, rubbing a hand over her face before finally meeting my gaze. "Your father left because he was a coward, because he couldn't handle the responsibility of being a parent, and because deep down I think he always believed he could come back whenever he wanted, and you'd still be here waiting for him." My stomach twisted. "But why now?" I asked. "Why did he come back today, of all days?" She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. "Mom," I pressed, my voice sharper now. "What aren't you telling me?" She exhaled slowly, then finally said the words that shattered whatever remnants of hope I had left. "He's sick." My breath caught. "What?" "I found out a few weeks ago," she admitted, her voice tinged with something that almost sounded like pity. "Stage 4 cancer. He doesn't have long." The world around me blurred, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a crushing force. "So that's why he came back?" I whispered, more to myself than to her. "Because he's dying?" She nodded. "I think so." And just like that, everything fell into place. He hadn't come back for me. He had come back because he was afraid to die alone. Because suddenly, after 15 years of silence, he had realized that there was no one left to mourn him, no one left to hold his hand when the end came. It wasn't love. It wasn't regret. It was fear. And yet, as much as the truth burned, I couldn't deny the small, aching part of me that still wanted to care. Because despite everything, despite the years of hurt and resentment, he was still my father. And I had to decide if I could live with letting him die alone. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply before finally speaking. "Where is he staying?" My mother looked at me, searching my face for an answer to a question she hadn't yet asked. "At a motel on the outskirts of town. He doesn't have much left." Of course he didn't. He had spent his whole life running, and now, at the very end, he had nowhere left to go. "Do you want to see him?" my mother asked gently. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, my heart hammering in my chest. Did I? Could I? I thought about everything he had missed. Every birthday, every heartbreak, every late night when I had convinced myself I wasn't worth loving because the one man who was supposed to love me the most had chosen to leave. I thought about the way he had looked at me today, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name, and I thought about the little girl I had once been, the one who had spent years waiting for her father to come back. She was gone now, but I wasn't. "No," I said finally, the decision settling over me like a quiet kind of peace. "I think I already got my goodbye." My mother nodded, and I felt light. Because I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't looking for answers that would never come, or love that had never been freely given. I was free. And when I turned back toward the church, toward the life that was waiting for me, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't my father's daughter anymore.